Good morning. My name is Anthony Morgan. I'm the policy and research lawyer at the African Canadian Legal Clinic. I'd like to thank members of the community and also members of the press for making it out this morning. In the name of the African Canadian community, our organizations, the African Canadian Legal Clinic, the Anti-Black Racism Network, Black Lives Matter Toronto, the Coalition of Black Trade Unionists, and the Urban Alliance on Race Relations have come together to deliver one clear and pointed message to Premier Wynne and Minister Naqvi. When it comes to carding and street checks, the answer is elimination, not regulation. While other communities have been disproportionately impacted by this practice of street checks and carding, the brunt of the burden has been borne by the African Canadian community, primarily young Black men. The practice has traumatized the African Canadian community. It has created the widespread sense that the fundamental rights and freedoms of African Canadians are negotiable and not inalienable. It has created the sense that we as a community can have our rights discussed over a consultation without recognizing that they are already enshrined in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Our organizations know that this practice is a fundamental violation of our human rights for a number of reasons. As we've seen across jurisdictions, in Toronto, in Peel, in Ottawa, in London, in Hamilton, consistently where there is data that has been released, race-based disaggregated data, we see a consistent overrepresentation of Black people. And so we resist and resent this practice as racist. It is a violation of our charter rights and the Ontario Human Rights Code for that reason. It is also a violation of our charter rights as it relates to arbitrary detention. The practice of street checks and carding is also a denial of our legal rights under the charter. It consists of unreasonable seizure of individuals' personal information, individuals not involved in crime, having that information stored and warehoused indefinitely within police services databases, and that's across Ontario. And finally, we resist and resent this practice because it features a deprivation of liberty under the charter. Now, that is our legal position, but it's also important that we humanize the experience that we're talking about, that you recognize that these are human beings. These are people who are going about their daily lives, picking up their children from school, walking to the bus stop, going to work, just enjoying or supposed to be enjoying their life while they are stopped in non-criminal encounters and have their information stored in warehouse and police services databases where we don't know what happens with that information. That is a problem, and it's a violation of our charter rights. But let's think about the particular impacts that this has. It has led individuals to lose job, volunteer, educational opportunities as well. It's created a chilling effect in the community and their willingness to go through the legal system, and not through criminal processes, but any engagement with the legal system has been stalled because individuals are afraid of the impact that interactions with police might have on their criminal proceeding or on their legal proceedings. It has significantly decreased the trust of the African Canadian community in the police as the protectors of public safety within our communities. It has eroded individual and communities' sense of belonging, security, and safety. It has detrimentally impacted African Canadians' sense of human dignity and self-worth. It has generated and exacerbated feelings of low self-esteem, hopelessness, and alienation among African Canadian youth. Also, this practice of carding and street checks has compromised African Canadians' sense of mental health and psychological well-being. And finally, the practice has institutionalized the criminalization of the African Canadian community. African Canadians are not second-class citizens. Again, I say African Canadians are not second-class citizens. To regulate the practice of street checks and carding is to write African Canadians out of full social and civic citizenship within Canada, full stop. This would be an affront to the free, fair, and democratic values that are supposed to govern our multicultural society. Our equality is not up for negotiation. And so we are calling, again, for, if we're going to see regulations towards the elimination of this practice. It is racial profiling, it is racist, and it is having detrimental and devastating impacts on the African Canadian community. That is our statement from the African Canadian Legal Clinic. I will now call on a representative. I will now call Dr. Rinaldo Walcott, a representative of the Anti-Black Racism Network, and also a professor at University of Toronto, to come and speak.
Thank you, Anthony. Good morning. My name is Rinaldo Walcott. Here we go again. This is quite like deja vu, if I do say so myself. I want to make 4 very brief points. Carding street checks is a late modern slave pass system. It particularly impacts Black people, African Canadian people. That's exactly what the slave pass was meant to do. Prohibit movement of Black people. Continue to produce Black people as out of place, as not belonging, to control them. This is a late modern slave pass. We have to be extremely clear about that. I want to stress also what Anthony said about this notion of a public consultation. The consultation is already warped by the language of police investigative tool, a potentially police investigative tool. This is deeply troubling and deeply problematic. And both Premier Wen and Minister Napi have much to answer for when they imagine that the rights of Black and African Canadian people can be negotiated through a consultation. We would not accept that under any other circumstances. There's a certain kind of moral and political bankruptcy at stake in these consultations. The other thing that I want to say is to make an analogy. So I speak here as a Black gay man. Premier Wen would never call for a consultation on the rights of the LGBT community in this fashion. It would not happen. There would be an outrage in this province. People will be calling for her resignation. So we must ask ourselves, what kinds of political and moral bankruptcy exists in their own understanding and relationship to the Black and African Canadian community that they think that this is actually an acceptable way to deal with the long history of anti-Black control of movement in North America, not just in Ontario, not just in the city of Toronto. So I want to say that it's really important that we push Premier Wen to lead on this issue in the same way that she has led on sexual and gendered violence. We must call her to task today and every day until carding disappears from the landscape of Ontario. Let me say this, if we do not do that, then we are co-signing along with Premier Wen and Minister Nathpi and Chief Saunders and Mayor Tory, we're co-signing practices that destine Black people to continue to be out of place in North America, and we will not stand for that. Thank you.
We'll now have Chris Wilson of the Coalition of Black Trade Unionists.
Good morning. I want to start by thanking the African Canadian Legal Clinic for convening this press conference on this critical issue affecting our community. In terms of context, I'm a member of the Coalition of Black Trade Unionists, which is a community organization representing 250 trade unionists of African descent in Ontario, but also Quebec and across the country, and is a chapter of CoBTU International representing 5,000 Black trade unionists across North America. In terms of the position of CoBTU, we want to be very clear that we stand in solidarity with our community allies on this critical issue of carding and take the clear position that carding should be abolished. Carding constitutes a form of arbitrary detention that infringes upon our basic human rights and needs to end. The Wynne government's call to regulate carding following consultations is not the answer. The practice of carding must end and not be modified through regulation. Activist Desmond Cole succinctly encapsulated the position of the Coalition of Black Trade Unionists during a rally for Black Lives Matter, where he said quite clearly, "If I'm free to go, just say so." What are we going to do? CoBTU will continue to stand in solidarity and support our community allies until this practice of carding is stopped. CoBTU recognizes carding as a labor issue. Trade unionists fight for healthy and safe workplaces, and by extension, we need healthy and safe communities. CoBTU, as active participants in the labor movement, will push the labor movement as a whole to become more engaged in the Black Lives Matter movement through solidarity and ongoing support. Finally, CoBTU will make the broader issue of the mass incarceration of people of African descent an election issue by holding Black Votes Matter sessions across Canada to ensure that the African Canadian community is engaged in the electoral process and makes our voices heard to end the practice of carding and stop the mass incarceration of peoples of African descent in this country. Thank you.
We'll now have Nigel Barif, the President of the Urban Alliance on Race Relations.
Thank you. The Urban Alliance on Race Relations joins the African Canadian Legal Clinic, the Anti-Black Racism Network, and the Coalition of Black Trade Unionists, and of course, Black Lives Matters, in opposing the ongoing practice of street checks or carding as a practice is known in Toronto. It is our position that the practice of randomly stopping individuals and collecting their information in a police database is an expression of systemic discrimination and racism in our society, a practice which particularly targets young black men in our city. As the African Canadian Legal Clinic lays out in their legal opinion, the practice of carding has led individuals to lose employment and educational opportunities due to these interactions appearing on police record checks. It has institutionalized and justified the criminalization of African Canadian community. It has eroded individuals and the community's collective sense of security and has detrimentally impacted African Canadians' sense of human dignity and created a chilling effect on the community's engagement in the legal system. The practice is arbitrary, unreasonable, and discriminatory. On the basis of experiences which community members have had with carding for many years, we support the ACLC's position that the ongoing carding violates the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedom and the Ontario Human Rights Code. The Ontario government should heed the extensive research and commentary documenting this discriminatory impact of carding and call for an immediate end to the practice. For years, the Urban Alliance on Race Relations has worked to address racism in society, working proactively with the broader community. In 1975, a group of concerned Torontonians got together to discuss the rise in hate-motivated violence against African and South Asian Canadians in the Toronto public spaces. Today, we persist in this work, examining the institutional racism that continues to face people of color and other groups experiencing discrimination. Less than 2 months ago, many of the same community members were present here, came together to express sadness and outrage at the death of Andrew Loku at the hands of police, a black man living with mental illness who was shot within 2 minutes of interaction with police. And like Sami Yatin, 2 years previously, Loku's death demonstrated the excessive police use of force against racialized and stigmatized community members, resulting in tragic death. These instances, like carding or police checks, only undermine the community's trust in police, so that they are not seen as protecting the public, particularly those who are most vulnerable, but as a threat to them. As a practice, carding is another example of excessive use of power and authority by police, and its a negative effect are essentially felt by people of color and in large majority by young black and brown people. The Urban Alliance on Race Relations joins in solidarity with the other community groups represented here and calls for its immediate end.
Finally, we have Tari Nangura from Black Lives Matter Toronto.
Hi, my name is Tari Nangura. I want to do a land acknowledgement first. I want to acknowledge that we are on Indigenous land and we're here today because it was colonized and continues to be colonized. Okay, so Black Lives Matter. The city's response to carding has been disingenuous from the start. The process was not well thought out or accessible to those mostly affected by carding. It was clear they were trying to avoid Toronto because they don't want to face the people directly affected. This is cowardly and a poor way to represent the needs of the public. We deserve to be heard, and we are tired of people making the decisions, running away from their responsibility in this manner, while black people stay being dehumanized in all different ways. It is this type of political culture that is complicit in anti-blackness and leads to both a loss of dignity at least and loss of life at worst. Yasir Naqvi and Kathleen Wynne have said they would not eliminate carding,